What's the link between software and your health? Hi, my name is Oded, and in this podcast I'll talk about software development in the field of medical device, pharmaceutical, and healthcare with industry-leading experts. Today, with the help of Brian Pass, we will take a closer look at requirements definition. Brian, thank you very much for participating. Before we dig in, maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure, Odette, and I am pleased to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Again, I am Brian Pate. I am partner and general manager of Software CPR. Software CPR is a regulatory consulting firm that's been around for about 21 years. It was founded in 1999 by Alan Cousinets, and consists of about 10 partners, and that most all of us have a lot of years of experience. I'm in my 37th year of medical device development, consulting, different factors. Software CPR has a mission of both education and consulting. I think the CPR is crisis prevention and recovery. We like to do a lot of crisis prevention. That's more of the educational side and training. We've been involved in a lot of the standards development, including IEC 62304, IEC 80002-1. Also, I was involved myself in creation of TIR 45, which is the use of agile methods with medical device software. But in addition to that educational part, we do a lot of audits and assessments of software documentation primarily, and we help with remediation and regulatory submissions to FDA. But I'm glad to be here, Odette, and look forward to talking to you about this more. My background, I should say, by the way, is a software developer originally. I was trained in biomedical engineering, did a lot of clinical research early in my career, and then a lot of software development, moving through different levels of technical management, and have been consulting now since 2006.
So maybe you can tell us what is the concept phase and why is it needed?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we think of a concept phase in any kind of product development, but certainly for medical device development, usually in a concept phase, we're trying to make sure we understand these terms like intended use. If you work in medical device, you hear this term intended use. This is really trying to understand the user needs, who would be using the medical device, what their needs are. And this is generally, we get into a topic that in the FDA and the US regulations under design controls, we call it design input. We're trying to understand what is the design input, what are the user needs in a way that's measurable in some way. So if I'm talking about a blood pressure monitor, I'm talking about accuracy of the blood pressure, range of the blood pressure measurement, patient populations that it's targeted for. This would be design input. This is the stuff that we want to try to understand during a concept phase. And again, they're usually captured in some kind of document, or such as a design input document, or something like a product requirements or even system requirements type document. So that's generally what's done in a concept phase. Now, in an agile type world, right, we don't really like the word phase, right? Phase implies sequences, and we want to try to, remove as many sequences as we can when they're unnecessary, right? So some of this concept phase activity might better be done as an emerging type activity that we, use the 80-20 rule. What do you know about the design input at this point? Move forward with that. And then as you learn more, you can refine the design input as the project proceeds.
So basically, this is not a document that we write it or a phase that we complete it and then it's over. It's an ongoing. It's just the beginning of really assessing the customer needs and what are we intending to do, the product that we are trying to make, right?
Right. I think traditionally, certainly when I started my career, we worked more in a waterfall type fashion. We had some very strict phases, and at each phase, there were certain types of documentation that had to be complete, or the intention was for it to be complete. But the reality of working that way, had downfalls, right? And a lot, one downfall might be that what I think is a requirement, and I try to lock that down. Later on, I may learn that that is not a requirement of the customer. And so, using a more iterative and incremental development process, especially with software centric type medical devices where there's a lot of software involved, can have its advantages. And so, whether you use phases and phase gate reviews and all that kind of stuff, the manufacturer has a lot of flexibility under the regulations, how you do that. At the end of the day, the design controls just require you to define your design inputs. And for example, and so how you capture, again, that's a capture of the user needs, and then just have a methodology that allows you to update that as you go, right? In other words, I can't know the exact user needs on day one, but I'm going to capture what I do know. And then I'm going to have a change control process that allows me to update the design inputs as I move forward with the project. And at a certain point, though, we do want to lock it down, right? And because we want to ship an iteration to a customer, but it's, it can be a more of an evolving thing, more of a backlog. And we just decide in the backlog, okay, this is enough customer value, deliver that. And then we keep working the backlog.
And do you see any validation activities starting at this stage, like maybe starting thinking about the risk assessment or?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a topic, Odette, that can cause a lot of confusion. If you read the design control regulations, the U.S. and 820.30, so this is in 21 CFR 820.30 is what's known as the design controls. I think item G in that list is what's called design validation. And this follows this progression, right? Design and development planning, design inputs, design outputs, design review, design verification. Finally, you get to design validation. And within design validation, you will see this topic, risk management, come up. So that's where everything we do associated with safety risk management comes about, is because of that design validation requirement in the regulations. But what you begin to understand about risk management is it's not something that's done late in the process, and it's only done really as part of design validation. It's really done throughout the process. So when we're in design and development planning, we need to plan for risk management, how we're going to do risk management. When we're in the design inputs, creating those and trying to understand user needs, we're immediately beginning to realize what are the harms that could occur to the patient or the caregiver or their environment from this medical device. What are the hazardous situations that can exist? So see, we're doing risk management throughout the life cycle of development, although it only shows up in the design validation topic of design controls. So in the concept phase, there are some risk management activities that you can do. As a matter of fact, you should do, because it should drive the development process.
Right. So how would you sum up the design outputs, if it's right to say, of this phase? And do you see also the use of prototypes in this phase as something that's very important?
Yeah, so really, this gets into the overall, how do you set up a life cycle that is iterative and that is incremental in terms of delivering value. And what you begin to realize is that if you're going to do that effectively, you're going to need to do planning during each iteration, some level of planning. For example, in Scrum, we might do sprint planning, right? We're going to need to do some level of design input elaboration and understanding, and that should go down as we move through more and more iterations. But There should be some design input activities and then design output. Now, in software development, design outputs, depending on how you think about these things, but I tend to think of design outputs as being the software we write, but also any design description that's necessary. A lot of times, software source code is not enough to understand the details. So, for example, if you implement a complicated algorithm in software, it's often useful, in fact, very often useful, to create a design description of that algorithm where you write it out in English or whatever your native language is so that other people can understand how the algorithm's implemented. And other design outputs that we would do during the iteration would be architectural updates, right? Software architecture is emerging iteration by iteration, right? So we need to update the software architecture. That's another design output. Software requirements. IEC 62304 talks about software requirements. If you want to be compliant with 62304, which, by the way, is a good idea, certainly if you want to market in the European Union, and FDA recognizes 62304 as a consensus standard. So it's if you do not follow 62304, I would ask you why not. But it talks about software requirements, Odette, and again, we want to be creating the software requirements as we move through the iteration. So you see all of the design control type activities occurring during the iteration. Certainly design and development planning, design input, design outputs, like I just said. But then you begin to think about issues like design review. So under US regulations, design review, that two-word phrase is, it's an important phrase. It's different than a technical review. We do all kinds of technical reviews during development. Design review is a special activity from a compliance standpoint in the US. And the key thing there is it requires an independent reviewer, someone independent of that design activity going on. So you could build that into your iteration if you wanted, or you could wait for certain synchronization points maybe in your development process, kind of up to you. But the last one that I'll bring up is design validation. So how might I do design validation during an iterative incremental development? And that's where formative usability is one very useful design validation type activity that you can build into your, iterative incremental development model. And formative, right? This is where we're going to really show it to some customers. We're going to have some types of evaluations where we get feedback from them.
Right, so that's kind of doing a small non-official usability study.
Right. Yeah, I think the formality, if I want to use that word, associated with formative usability is less than something we might do toward the end of the project, where we're going to really evaluate the usability more like a grade, more like an exam. You take a course in college, you have an exam at the end, right? It's final exam. That's more of what we would call summative usability. Now, during the development, I might, maybe we have a critical task, a task that the user needs to perform that's associated with safety in some way. And that's the ones we're most interested in ensuring the users perform as we expect them to, right? So in a formative test during development, one of the engineers, she might say, hey, I've got some ideas, 2 different ways I think the user could do this. Let's do a quick usability study with 3 or 4 real users, and let's get their preference, or let's get the one that they perform best at, right? And you do a little formative along the way, right? So by the time you get to the final exam, you have a high confidence that you've designed in the most effective ways and the ways that critical tasks are going to be done without error. This is ideal, right? This is the way we want it to work.
That's a great insight. Maybe going back to the concept phase, how do you see what is the difference between the user need, the, let's say, document that you said, or documenting the user needs, the product requirement specification, the system requirement specification? Are they all the same? Are these just synonyms?
Well, you have flexibility in what you call things in terms of certainly from a U.S. requirements. And, in the standards community, there maybe is somewhere along the line, you're going to have something called software requirements. But what you do at, those higher layers, and it is, the way I think of it, again, you have flexibility, but somewhere along the line, you're going to need to capture the, what FDA would call design input. I'm trying to, 82304 is another standard out there, IEC 82304. Now it's for health software. So this would be SAMD, but it's a useful standard to think about in this area, but it talks about use requirements in 82304. It talks about things like requirements that address the intended use, interface requirements, does the system interface to other systems? But at that level, we want to capture them. Now, my preference, if somebody was asking me, is to have product requirements and system requirements. Product requirements are something that the user would understand. It would be meaningful to them. So if I created a mobile app that you could use the camera to take a picture of a skin lesion, and I wrote software for that mobile app that would determine if that skin lesion was malignant or benign skin cancer, right? I got some fancy software, right? And I write that software. Well, my product requirements would be things along the lines of this software application can evaluate skin lesions as small as 5 millimeters in diameter up to diameters of, 65 millimeters, right? See, this is a testable type product requirement. And it's meaningful to the user because the user is the one that says, hey, I want to be able to use this to evaluate skin lesions, right? And then I might say it has a sensitivity of some sensitivity and specificity for, ground truth, right? So we would do some kind of study to show that when we took, 1,000 patients and we evaluated it with our software compared to a dermatologist or something along those lines, that our sensitivity, specificity was equal to or exceeded maybe those dermatologists, right? That would be in product requirements, right? And guess what? Product requirements is what we're going to want to perform design validation activities against, okay? Now, the system requirements might be something along the lines of, this has to be done using an iPhone 12 because it has a fancy camera in it that I need, right? And so that's more of a system requirement. The user, that's a technology decision. They don't care. It's not really a product requirement. It's a system requirement. In other words, I can't meet the product requirements unless these system requirements are in place. I got to have an iPhone 12 because it's got the fancy camera. There might be other system requirements. I have to have Wi-Fi access because this thing uses a interface to the cloud to compare images or something along those lines, right? But that would be system requirements. And, none of that really gets down to 62304 software requirements yet, though, which you probably noticed right under that.
Right. That's the next question. I mean, how does this all relate to the software requirements?
Yeah. So, a lot of people would call this flow down. We flow those product requirements and system requirements down to the software. And we say, okay, your software needs to achieve these product requirements and system requirements. And again, if you think of an iterative development, some of the, there might be a backlog item that drove all of this activity, right? Some kind of story or maybe, or just a backlog item that said, I need to be able to evaluate skin lesions, very small skin lesions or whatever, right? And that led to, during the iteration, I write a product requirement and I come up with these dimensions, this range, small to large. I write the product requirement, and maybe during that same iteration, we're writing system requirements. And then during that same iteration, we're starting to write our software requirements as well, and our software design, and we're formulating architecture, and we're writing software so that at the end of the iteration, we can have some kind of sprint review. We can look at all the design outputs, right? Now that's a bunch of design outputs that came out, and we can evaluate them. And again, if we got a large, a team that can do a lot of those activities in parallel, we could get a lot done. But, again, that's all about velocity and how big of a backlog item you want to try to tackle. But at the end of the iteration, I should be able to evaluate, whether, I do verification and maybe some formative validation and maybe some design validation. Maybe I have a database, an annotated database of images of skin lesions, and I can even be doing some validation of some early attempts at the algorithm or something like that. But software requirements would emerge during the iteration. The goal would be that they're documented. TIR 45 from that document, if you're familiar with it, it talks about this process of thinking, documenting, then formalizing, right? That's the life cycle of a requirement. We're thinking about what the software should do. We began to document what we think the software requirements are. And then at a certain point, we formalize it. No big deal, because on the next iteration, we can refine those requirements if we want, or we could add new ones, different things, right? That's just the process.
Right. So maybe just a small clarification. Would you say the software requirements are kind of, let's say you've got system requirement specification, and then you just put them in different basket. This goes to the hardware specification, this goes to the software specification, or is it really, there's really a difference between the system requirement and the software requirement? Are they different levels of details?
I think of them as different. I try to keep the system requirement, at a higher level. So if we're dealing with say a blood pressure monitor, okay, it's got, electronics, it has mechanical things like pumps and solenoids, but it has software in it as well. It might have software for a user interface. It might have firmware that's controlling the pump and reading pressure transducers. So system requirements, may speak to something that involves software and electronics and maybe mechanical. For example, if I have a system requirement that says the system shall be capable of pumping or of achieving pressure inside the blood pressure cuff up to 400 millimeters of mercury. Okay, that's kind of a system requirement. Again, a user doesn't care, about that. They only care about actually blood pressure readings. But a system requirement is, I need to be able to achieve, some pressure like that. Well, guess what? That's more than just a software requirement, right? It's, the electrical engineer had to select the right, drive circuit for the pump to supply enough current that the pump needs to inflate. Mechanical, the engineers had to select the pump, had to select the correct valves, the tubing, you get into material selection, there's just a lot going on there, right? And that's at a system requirement. We just simply said we wanted to be able to pump to 400 millimeters of mercury. But because we said that, we had a lot of software requirements that are going to come out of that, electrical design requirements. Now, one thing I'll just take a tangent here and say is, over the years, I ended up managing, entire engineering groups. And I used to tell the non-software engineers, I said, you guys have it easy. No one pressures you to have an electrical development process defined or a mechanical. You may do it for business reasons, but software gets all this special treatment, right? We have a whole standard 62304 about the process of designing software, right? So we may not end up with a hardware requirement specification. It could be the system requirement goes straight to an electrical design spec, and that's it. That's the only document they need. Maybe a mechanical materials specification or something like that. But on the software side, that system requirement is going to trace down to a lot of software requirements necessary to achieve the 400 millimeters of mercury.
Who is the one that gives the input to describe the software requirements, and who take this design output and start going to the design phase? I mean, just the border between what is a requirement, what is a design. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more about this?
Yeah, and again, this is going to vary, between, for example, a blood pressure monitor that has firmware, or I'm writing a cloud service that's an algorithm. Both of them could be medical device software. And so who writes the software requirement can differ. If I'm in a blood pressure monitor, maybe I do need, maybe a software engineer who had maybe more of an electronics background, right, or something. So they understand better the types of software requirements that are going to need to be written. For example, you could have aliasing of reading a pressure transducer signal or something along those lines, right? So the software requirements need to might include things like writing low pass filters, avoiding aliasing. Whereas, if I'm working on a cloud service, it's higher level. I'm trying to decide which open source software packages are appropriate for use, right? So it can vary. Now, the specific point you brought up is an interesting one, right? What is a requirement versus what is a design specification or design detail? I usually just ask myself the question, software requirement is more about what should the software do. A design specification is more of how does it do it. So what do I need to do? I need, the software shall maintain a list of currently active patients in the clinic at any given time, right? It's more of the, software requirement level. The design level might get into, we'll use the ZQ, class to manage patients, and there's an attribute of which one's active or something. It just gets more into the detail of how we did it. Now, the other thing we hadn't really touched on a lot, Odette, and maybe it's be a good topic for another discussion, would be in the area of how much detail do I need for any of this, right? How much detail do I need for a system requirement, for a software requirement, for a software design specification, for architecture? How much detail do I need? How much is enough, right?
Right, that's also like kind of where do I feel sometimes the difference between a requirement and the design. It's also that the design is very detailed, like a detailed algorithm probably feels more like a design than a requirement, but it's just...
Yeah. One rule of thumb that I always used is if it's not apparent from the source code or it's difficult to understand from the source code, I generally wanted some level of a design description or design specification to help explain it, what's not obvious. When I worked as a software engineer, at different times in my career, I might have been in charge of a particular software component. And at a certain point, maybe we were transitioning that component to some other person who was going to enhance it or maintain it or something. And so someone might have said, hey, Brian, why don't you go talk to Kathy because she's going to take over the, algorithm or whatever, right? Now, I could just go to Kathy and say, hey, Kathy, that code is in this repository. See you later, right? But that probably wouldn't be what I did, right? I probably said, hey, that code is in this particular repository, but there's some things you need to know, okay? And I would probably start telling her some key things that she needs to keep in mind related to that software. Whatever I tell her, that's what ought to be in a design specification, right? Because if I get hit by a car, and didn't get a chance to tell her that, we lost it. We lost that. There's that information that you just can't get from looking at the source code, right? So that's a good rule of thumb for me. I would say the other thing just in general is if you tell me you have some kind of algorithm, I'm usually looking for you to have some description of that. And the software design description is a good place for it. So at a minimum, that would be the software design description I would look for. The other good rule of thumb there is risk. See, risk management, we hadn't talked a lot about that. That's how we know where we need the detail. So if that software is associated with mitigating risk, or if that software itself could lead to a risk or hazardous situation, then you're going to need design detail. And 62304 supports that notion, right? We have the whole concept of software safety classification, and that's exactly what it's trying to point out.
Can you maybe give advice for your expectation from software developers in this industry? What do they need to know, or once they decide to get involved with medical device software, about those requirement definition, design definition, the guidelines? What is your general advice to help them become a better solution providers?
Yeah, great question, Odette. I think that one thing I would do for sure is look at IEC 62304. One reason for that is just keep in mind in 1990 that when the U.S. Medical Device Act came about, and that's when design controls were added to the regulations. And so in that same 820.30G, it used the two-word phrase software validation, and manufacturers were asking, I was in that group of people asking, what do you mean by software validation? And what that led to after several years was a request that a software development standard be created to help manufacturers. And originally, the Amy took on the task, and the founder of our company, Alan Cousinets, he was the leader of creating what was called SW68. SW68 became IEC 62304. So it is a medical device process or software development process standard created just for medical device, right? So that's the first place to start, right? You've got the collective wisdom of a lot of people that put that together and said, hey, this is a minimum bar of how you do this. The second thing I think that's really helpful is FDA during that same time frame wrote a document called the General Principles of Software Validation. It's really old, it's free. 62304 you got to pay for, but the General Principles of Software Validation is free, downloaded off the FDA's website. And it's old, but it's still extremely useful to read through to get an idea of really you understand, what the reviewers, for example, at FDA would read to have their understanding. So those two, I think, are great resources. A third thing then I might recommend is watch recalls, that's a great way to learn what isn't working, in one concept, right? When you see a recall, try to understand was software involved in that. What could software have done to have mitigated that, prevented, usually if a recall occurred, right, there's a potential for safety harm, or maybe there already has been harm that occurred to a patient. You just ask yourself questions. What could we have done differently given that situation. Now, sometimes you can't discern that information from the recalls, but it's a good activity. It's an activity I've done for many, many years.
And so would you say this is like there are the different silos? There's QA that needs to know about the regulation, and the programmer can concentrate only on being a good software engineer. I guess from your answer already, that's not the case. But where is the borderline? I mean, how much of regulation or specific FDA requirements do you think is beneficial for the programmer to know? You mentioned looking at the recalls, and that's really where the safety concern is, but also about the project success concern, because the issue is that I think sometimes programmers, they feel this everything is very red tape, and that makes the project fail. So that's maybe not a safety risk, but that's maybe a financial risk for those companies.
Well, my view is you should not be doing one activity that you do not feel is contributing to quality, because you and the regulator have the same goal. And so 62304, for example, if you read through it, I think I've never met a software engineer who did not want to create high quality software, at least in the medical device field where I've worked. So our goal is the same. And so you're most successful, in my view, when you take the quality activities that you believe in, right, that you believe are leading to higher quality software, and you align those with what the regulations require, not the other way around, right? So we don't have one way we develop and then another way that we document it for regulators. Because what happens if you do that, right, is it's not value added. It's not valued by the software people. And you end up kind of like, well, I've got this other group that does that, and we're not in this together. See, I think an effective organization is QA, QE, software development, test development, production, DevOps, even regulatory affairs. We're all in, a collaborative group working together, same goals in mind. So, we don't probably have time to get into that a lot, but, many of these tools that are available today can allow you to work the way you like to work. The tools are capturing the electronic records you need to demonstrate compliance. And so it's a good day when what you're doing is what you need for the regulator. So you're not doing any extra activities.
Brian, thank you so much. Maybe you can tell people how can they follow you. I know that there was also offer superb courses on software validation. Maybe also tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. We're easy to find. It's, if you just go to softwarecpr.com, so that's the word software with the letters cpr.com, you can learn more about us. We do teach public courses and private courses. I would say our 3-day 62304 course is extremely popular. We've taught it now worldwide. We routinely probably teach 200 people a year these days, and it's useful for both software development organizations, QA, regulatory, project management, product owners. We do have a kind of an agile theme that flows through that course now, since most all of our clients are agile oriented. And but you can learn more there. Our website actually has a lot of information there that you can peruse through and can be helpful to you in your career. There's a place to ask questions. If you have questions, just drop us a question on the website. I'd love to answer that. And I appreciate you taking the time today, Odette. It was a lot of fun.